The late autumn sun did little to soften the bite of the air in the high valley. It was a clear, cold light that made the distant peaks look like shards of broken bone against the blue. Down in the settlement of Providence, the townsfolk were mending roofs and salting the last of their meat, their movements brisk with the urgency of the coming winter. All except for Agnes. She was moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a stark contrast to the hurried energy around her. She hauled a heavy, burlap-wrapped block of ice from the shaded creek bed, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The ice, harvested from the deep freeze of the previous winter and insulated through the summer under a thick blanket of sawdust and earth in a northern ravine, was the cornerstone of her peculiar work. Mr. Finch, leaning against the porch post of his mercantile, watched her pass. A smirk played on his lips. He called out, his voice carrying easily in the thin air, storing up the cold again, "Agnes." "A person might think you're trying to keep your heart from thawing." Several men nearby chuckled, their laughter a rough, careless sound. Agnes didn't turn or acknowledge him. Her focus was on the worn path to her cabin at the edge of the settlement, and on the immense weight she pulled on a crude wooden sledge. Her arms, corded with sinew, ached with a familiar fire. The path led to a heavy, low-lying door set almost flat against the ground beside her small home. With a grunt, she heaved it open, revealing a set of steep stone steps descending into darkness. A wave of profound cold washed out, a cold that felt ancient and deep. This was her cellar, her folly, the subject of countless jokes and whispers. Down in the earth, she had not just a root cellar, but a cavern lined with thick stone she had placed herself, year after year. The walls were glazed with a permanent sheen of ice, and the air was so still and frigid it felt like a physical presence. She maneuvered the block down the steps and into its place alongside dozens of others, a frozen wall in the heart of the earth. In shelved alcoves carved into the dirt, neat bundles of last season's berries, beans, and hardy greens lay frozen solid, each wrapped in cloth and labeled with a charcoal mark. Her work was a silent testament to a past she never spoke of, a past that had taught her that the land's generosity was fleeting, and that winter was not a season, but a predator. The town saw eccentricity, Agnes knew it was memory. The first snows arrived not as a gentle blanket, but as a volley of hard, sharp pellets driven by a wind that screamed down from the mountain passes. It did not dust the ground, it scoured it. The sky, which for weeks had been a crisp, hopeful blue, turned the color of a deep bruise and stayed that way. The usual cheer of the first snowfall was absent. There was no laughter, no children with sleds. Instead, people watched from their windows, a knot of unease tightening in their bellies. The storm was wrong. The old-timers, men who had seen 40 winters in these mountains, confessed they'd never witnessed a wind with such a malicious voice or snow that fell with such relentless density. Reverend Miller spoke of trials and tribulations from his pulpit, his voice straining to be heard over the howl of the gale against the small church's windows. His words about faith felt like thin parchment against a rising tide. The confidence of the harvest season evaporated, replaced by a grim, watchful silence. Within 3 days, the path leading out of the valley was gone, erased by a rolling sea of white. The world shrank to the confines of Providence. Then it shrank further, to the 4 walls of each cabin. The snow piled up against doors, burying windows on the north-facing walls, plunging homes into a perpetual twilight. The wind never stopped. It sculpted the drifts into monstrous shapes, waves frozen in the act of crashing over the tiny settlement. It found every crack in the chinking, every loose board in a roof, and whispered its chilling threats into the very heart of their homes. Agnes, inside her small, sturdy cabin, felt the siege as keenly as anyone. But for her, the feeling was not one of surprise. She moved with the same methodical calm she always had, checking the seals on her windows, ensuring her chimney drew clean and strong. While others looked out at the storm with growing fear, she listened to it with a grim and knowing respect. It was an old adversary, and she had spent years preparing for its return. The world beyond her door had become a formless, roaring whiteness, an elemental chaos that had swallowed the familiar lines of the landscape whole, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the subtle shifts in the grey light that filtered through snow-caked windows. The storm did not break, it merely paused for breath before resuming its assault. The snow was no longer a covering, it was a new geography, a solid, unforgiving landscape that had buried fences, sheds, and the very memory of pathways. To move between cabins was a monumental effort of tunneling and exhaustion. Firewood, once abundant, became the settlement's most precious currency. Stacks that were meant to last until spring dwindled at an alarming rate. The cold was a physical entity, a beast that clawed its way inside, leeching warmth from the hearth, from bones, from hope itself. Soon, a more insidious fear followed: hunger. At the mercantile, Mr. Finch's shelves grew bare. He began rationing, first sugar and flour, then salt, then everything. His demeanor shifted from smug superiority to that of a beleaguered king ruling a shrinking domain. His prices climbed with the snowdrifts, and quiet resentment simmered in the ration lines. The first to truly suffer were the children. A chorus of hacking coughs echoed in the unnatural quiet of the town. Clara's boy, Thomas, was the worst. A fever took hold of him, and he lay listless in his cot, his breathing shallow. He refused the salted meat and hard bread she offered, his small body craving something it could not have. Clara watched him fade, a little more each day, and the terror she felt was a coldness far deeper than the one outside. The social fabric of Providence, woven from shared hardship and mutual reliance, began to unravel. A family's woodpile was raided in the night. An ugly argument broke out over a sack of potatoes. The easy familiarity of the small community was replaced by suspicion and drawn, anxious faces. Laughter was a forgotten language. The silence that fell between the shrieking gusts of wind was heavy with the weight of what was unspoken, that they were trapped, that their careful preparations were not enough, and that the winter was slowly starving them into ghosts. They had believed themselves masters of this valley, but they were merely its prisoners. One afternoon, when the wind had quieted to a low moan and the world was a uniform, blinding white, Clara made a decision. She wrapped herself in every spare piece of wool she owned until she could barely move, kissed her son's hot forehead, and stepped out into the trench that led from her door. The journey to Agnes's cabin, a walk of a few minutes in the summer, was a grueling pilgrimage through a frozen labyrinth. The cold seared her lungs, and the sheer, oppressive silence of the snow-drowned world felt like a weight on her soul. She stumbled to the door of the small cabin at the edge of town, the only one with a thin but steady plume of smoke rising from its chimney. Her knuckles, numb and clumsy, rapped against the thick wood. For a long moment, there was no answer. Clara was about to knock again, her hope failing, when the bolt scraped back. Agnes stood in the doorway, a figure framed by the warm, dim light of her home. Her face was impassive, her eyes holding a deep, ancient stillness that seemed to absorb Clara's frantic desperation without judgment. "Agnes," Clara began, her voice cracking, the word a puff of white in the air. "Please. It's my Thomas. The fever won't break, and he can't keep anything down. He needs something green. A broth. Anything." She looked past Agnes into the cabin, a place of stark order and quiet purpose. There was no sign of the desperation that gripped every other home. Agnes was silent for a long time, her gaze unwavering. It was not a cold gaze, but a heavy one, as if she were weighing not just Clara's request, but the entire future of the town. In that silence, Clara felt the full weight of her foolishness, the memory of her own quiet smiles at the jokes about the strange widow and her ice pit. Finally, Agnes spoke, her voice low and even. "There will be no charity. Charity makes people weak. It makes them wait for a hand that might not come tomorrow." She paused, letting the words settle. "There will be work. And there will be order. Go back. Tell anyone who wants to eat. One portion of food for one day's labor for the good of all. That is the only way." She stepped back inside for a moment and returned with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was cold to the touch. "Boil this. Slowly. It will make a thin broth, but it will be enough for tonight." Clara clutched the bundle, the frozen shapes of herbs and chopped greens pressing against her palm. It felt heavier than gold. "Thank you," she whispered, tears freezing on her lashes. Agnes simply nodded and closed the door, leaving Clara alone in the vast, silent white with the first fragile seed of hope. The news of Clara's visit traveled not by word of mouth, but through the desperate, silent network of watching eyes. The next morning, as a weak, watery sun cast a pale light over the snow, a small group of men gathered near Agnes's cabin. They were hesitant, their pride warring with the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. They carried shovels and axes, their expressions a mixture of shame and necessity. Finn, a lanky youth of 17 whose quiet watchfulness had always set him apart, was the first to approach the door. Agnes opened it before he could knock. She looked at the small assembly, her gaze sweeping over their faces, and then nodded once. "The roofs," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "The weight of the snow will crush them. We start there. Clear the for heaviest laden roofs before midday. Then we eat." There were no arguments, only a quiet acceptance of the new reality. Agnes was not their leader in title, but her quiet authority was absolute, born of a foresight they had all ridiculed. She handed Finn a sturdy shovel. "You stay. I need help below." She led him not into her cabin, but to the heavy cellar door. The cold that rose from the depths was breathtaking. Down in the earth, the ice cellar was a revelation. It was a place of perfect, frozen order. Lantern light glinted off the ice-slicked stone walls and the massive blocks that formed the cellar's core. On wooden shelves, frozen stacks of berries, squash, beans, and greens were arranged with meticulous care. It was a library of summer, a vault of life suspended against the endless white death outside. Agnes moved with practiced efficiency, explaining the system to Finn. "We touch nothing without purpose. We take only what is needed for the day. The cold is our guardian, but waste is our enemy." Finn listened, his youthful face serious. He saw not just food, but a philosophy. He saw the years of hard, lonely labor it had taken to create this place. He began to understand that Agnes had not been preparing for a storm, but for a certainty. While the men worked on the roofs above, their grunts and the scrape of their shovels a muffled rhythm, Finn became her apprentice in the art of survival. He learned how to portion the frozen vegetables, how to select the right herbs for a nourishing broth, and how to reseal the stores to protect them from the slightest change in temperature. Up above, the men worked with a purpose they hadn't felt in weeks. They were not just clearing snow, they were earning their lives. When the work was done, Agnes served a thin but hot stew in her cabin. It was the first truly nourishing meal any of them had eaten in over a month. They ate in silence, the simple act of swallowing the warm food a profound communion. The mockery that had once defined Agnes was a distant, foolish memory. In its place, a new and powerful respect was beginning to take root, as deep and as solid as the frozen earth beneath their feet. As the days turned into another week, the system Agnes had established became the new pulse of the settlement. Each morning, a work detail was assigned, checking the structural integrity of the cabins, clearing pathways for common use, splitting and rationing the dwindling wood supply, and tending to the sick. In return, each worker received a carefully measured portion from the ice cellar. The grumbling and suspicion that had poisoned the town faded, replaced by a shared, quiet determination. However, not everyone accepted the new order. Mr. Finch, whose authority had been built on coin and inventory, found himself powerless. His store was empty, his money worthless. He watched as the town's respect shifted from him to the quiet widow he had so openly mocked. One afternoon, as Agnes and Finn were distributing the day's rations, Finch confronted her, his face flushed with anger and wounded pride. "This isn't right," he declared, his voice louder than any had been for weeks. "You've set yourself up as a queen, hoarding all the food and doling it out as you see fit. That food should be shared. It belongs to the community." A small crowd gathered, their faces tense. They looked from Finch's indignant expression to Agnes's calm demeanor. Agnes finished handing a bundle to a young mother and then turned to face him. Her voice was not angry, but it held a cold, hard clarity that cut through Finch's bluster. "Nothing in that cellar belongs to the community," she said. "It belongs to my labor. It is the result of my sweat and my foresight." While you were selling cheap whiskey and laughing from your porch, she took a step closer, and Finch instinctively took one back. "I am not deciding who eats," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the onlookers. "I am deciding who is willing to work to keep us all alive. Your coin is worthless here, Mr. Finch. It cannot clear a roof or feed a child. A strong back and a willing spirit are the only currency in this valley now. If you wish to eat, pick up a shovel. The community needs the mercantile's roof cleared. A heavy silence fell. Finch's face cycled through a series of emotions: rage, humiliation, and finally, a dawning, bitter understanding. He was no longer a man of importance. He was just another hungry mouth. No one spoke in his defense. The men and women standing there had felt the satisfying ache of meaningful labor in their bones and the warmth of earned food in their bellies. They had seen the system work. Defeated, Finch turned without another word and walked away. The confrontation was over. Agnes had not raised her voice, had not made a single threat, but she had cemented her authority more completely than any decree. The new social contract of Providence had been tested, and it had held. The world had been white for so long that they had nearly forgotten other colors existed. Then one day, against the vast, pale emptiness to the west, 3 dark shapes appeared. They were barely distinguishable from the shadows, stumbling figures that seemed to rise from the snow itself. A cry went up, a sound of alarm and disbelief. Men grabbed their axes, not out of aggression, but from a deep, instinctual fear of the unknown. The figures drew closer, moving with the agonizing slowness of complete exhaustion. It was a man, a woman, and a boy no older than 10. They were wrapped in ragged hides, their faces gaunt and blackened by frostbite. When they reached the edge of the settlement, the man collapsed into the snow, unable to take another step. They were from a small homestead several miles down the valley, a place no one had been able to reach since the first snowfall. Their cabin had been crushed by a massive drift a week prior. They had survived on nothing but melted snow and the last of their salted meat, traveling in the brief moments when the wind died down, guided only by a desperate hope that Providence still stood. The villagers brought them to the relative warmth of the church, their presence sending a shockwave through the fragile ecosystem of survival Agnes had built. They were strangers. They were mouths to feed, bodies too weak to work. Finn found Agnes by her cabin, his young face etched with conflict. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice low. "The cellar, it's not endless, Agnes. We've been careful, but there's only enough for a few more weeks if we're lucky." For us, the unspoken question hung in the frigid air between them. Helping the newcomers would be an act of pure charity, a violation of the primary rule that had kept them all alive: no work, no food. It was a brutal equation, but one that had imposed order on their desperation. Whispers spread through the settlement. Pity warred with a primal fear of scarcity. "We barely have enough for our own," one man muttered, his words capturing the sentiment of many. The entire community looked to Agnes, their silent faces asking the same question. The weight of their gazes, of their collective future, settled onto her shoulders. She stood for a long time, watching the grey sky, the fate of 3 souls and the deeply held principles of a whole community resting on her decision. Agnes walked to the church, the crunch of her boots on the packed snow the only sound. Inside, the air was still and cold, thick with the smell of pine and fear. The 3 newcomers were huddled under a pile of thin blankets near the dormant stove, the woman cradling her son while her husband shivered uncontrollably. Reverend Miller stood by, his face a mask of helpless compassion. The villagers crowded in the doorway, their expressions grim. Agnes knelt beside the collapsed man. She felt his forehead, then gently examined the woman and child. She saw not just liabilities, not just a drain on their precious resources, but the reflection of their own fragility. She saw what they all could have become. She rose and turned to face the people of Providence, her people. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried to every corner of the small building. "The rule was made for a reason," she began, her eyes meeting theirs one by one. "It was made to stop us from turning on each other. It was made to keep us from becoming animals, fighting over the last scrap. It was about order." She paused, letting them remember the chaos and fear that had preceded her system. "But if we turn them away now, if we let them die at our feet because they are too weak to lift a shovel today, then we have already become animals. The rule was meant to preserve our lives, but it must not be at the cost of our humanity." She looked towards the shivering family. "We will feed them. We will give them a portion of our own. It is a debt. When they are strong, they will repay it with their labor, just like everyone else. The murmur went through the crowd, a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. It was Reverend Miller who stepped forward, his voice firm. The widow is right. The Lord tests us not in our moments of abundance, but in our moments of scarcity. This is our test. His support galvanized them. The dissent, born of fear, subsided. That evening, the stew was thinner than it had ever been, but it was shared by all. The newcomers ate with tears streaming down their faces, their gratitude a palpable force in the room. It was a meager meal, but it was a moral victory. They had chosen compassion over cold logic, community over individual survival. In that shared act of sacrifice, they affirmed that they were more than just survivors, they were a society, bound by something more than just a wall of snow. The long winter had taken much from them, but on that day, it gave them something back they didn't even know they had lost. The change began not with a grand announcement from the heavens, but with a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic dripping, a sound so foreign that at first, people thought they were imagining it. Water. Icicles that had clung to the eaves for months, growing into monstrous teeth, began to weep. The sun, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, carried a hint of genuine warmth. The thaw had begun. It was not a gentle arrival. It was a slow, messy, and often dangerous process. The immense weight of the snow became saturated with water, triggering small avalanches from the steep hillsides and causing several outbuilding roofs to groan and collapse. The packed snow in the pathways turned to a thick, strength-sapping slush. But with the danger came an undeniable surge of hope. It was a physical release of pressure, as if the entire valley had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The world began to reveal itself again. The tops of fence posts emerged, then the outlines of buried woodpiles. The hard, sharp edges of the landscape softened. Under Agnes's continued, quiet guidance, the work of the community shifted. They were no longer just surviving, they were preparing for rebirth. Work crews, now including the recovered newcomers, dug channels to divert the meltwater, preventing floods. They assessed the damage to each cabin, sharing lumber and tools to make repairs. They began the arduous task of clearing the planting fields, a back-breaking effort of shoveling away tons of heavy, wet snow to expose the frozen soil beneath, hoping to give it time to soften for the spring seeds. The people themselves had been transformed. They were thinner, their faces etched with the lines of hardship, but their eyes held a new resilience. The petty squabbles and hierarchies of the previous autumn were gone, burned away by the long, cold fire of the winter. They moved together with an unspoken understanding, a community forged in the crucible of shared crisis. Agnes watched them from her porch, a silent overseer. She offered advice when asked, pointing out which snowbanks were likely to slide, which timbers needed reinforcing. She was no longer the strange widow, the object of ridicule or a reluctant queen. She was an elder, a repository of wisdom that they now understood was not eccentricity, but the deepest form of care. The ice cellar had saved their bodies, but her example had saved their spirit. Spring arrived in a rush of green so vibrant it almost hurt the eyes. The creek, which had been a silent, frozen snake, now roared with life, its water cold and clear. The sharp, clean scent of damp earth and new pine needles replaced the stale air of winter confinement. The scars of their ordeal were still visible, the splintered wood of a collapsed shed, the high water marks on cabin walls, the lingering gauntness in the faces of the children. But these were marks of survival, not defeat. Life was returning to the valley. Inside Agnes's cellar, the great blocks of ice had shrunk, and the shelves were nearly bare. Only a few bundles of dried herbs and frozen roots remained. Its purpose was served. It stood now not as a larder, but as a monument, a silent, cold testament to the winter that had almost broken them. Agnes sat on her small porch, the warm sun on her face. In the cleared field below, Finn was showing a group of younger boys the proper way to dig a drainage ditch, his movements confident and sure. He was no longer just a boy, the winter had forged him into a man, imbued with a quiet competence that reminded Agnes of someone she had lost long ago. The people of Providence were already preparing for the next winter, but this time they did so together. They were planning a communal woodlot, organizing teams to repair the path out of the valley, and drawing up plans to build a second, larger ice cellar near the center of town. They had learned Agnes's lesson. She reached into her apron pocket and her fingers closed around a small, smooth stone, its surface worn slick by years of anxious rubbing. It was a memento from another life, another place, another loss that had taught her the brutal necessity of looking ahead. A group of children ran past her cabin, their laughter bright and unrestrained, a sound she had not realized how much she had missed. Clara's son, Thomas, was among them, his cheeks now full and rosy. He waved to her, a wide, innocent grin on his face. Agnes raised her hand in a slow, deliberate wave back. The town no longer saw a peculiar, lonely widow. They saw the woman who had shown them the way through the dark. And Agnes, for the first time in many, many years, looked out at the faces of her neighbors and did not feel entirely alone. The ice around her own heart, stored for so long, had perhaps begun to thaw.